Back when roosters were the alarm clocks and stoves burned wood, farm families made breakfast from whatever the land gave. No eggs? No problem. Leftover biscuits? They never went to waste. These humble meals filled bellies and hearts alike. Come see the breakfasts that built a nation. Eggless depression. Pancakes. Can you imagine flipping pancakes without a single egg or splash of milk? Picture yourself standing in a farmhouse kitchen at dawn, frost painting the windows while the cast-iron pan sizzles on a wood-burning stove. The smell of browned batter floats through the chilly morning air, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and the faint aroma of coffee brewing in the background. Just flour, water, baking soda, and a pinch of salt, whisked until smooth in a chipped ceramic bowl that's seen 1,000 breakfasts. The batter is thinner than what we'd expect today, almost watery, but that's the secret. Spoonfuls hit the pan with a satisfying hiss as they touch hot fat, maybe lard saved from Sunday's pork roast, or bacon grease carefully collected in a tin can beside the stove. You wait for the bubbles to form on the surface, just like modern pancakes, then flip with a well-worn spatula that's been passed down through generations. They're thin, golden, a little chewy, and a lot comforting. The edges crisp up slightly, while the center stays tender. These flapjacks filled bellies when hens weren't laying through the harsh winter months, and money wasn't flowing like it used to. Not fancy, but they stuck to your ribs, Grandma used to say with a knowing wink, ladling another spoonful onto the griddle. Cornmeal mush. Ever heard of the dish that kept more folks alive than toast and eggs combined? Walk into any farmhouse kitchen between 1920 and 1940, and you'd likely find a bubbling pot on the back of the stove, steam curling up as ground corn slowly thickens in salted water, stirring itself into something that would sustain a family through the longest, coldest months. Just cornmeal, water, and salt. Maybe a splash of milk if the cow had been generous that morning, and there was enough left over after the butter-making and cheese-pressing were done. The process was meditative, stirring with a wooden spoon worn smooth by countless hands, watching as the mixture thickened to a soft, porridge-like consistency, hearty and warm, and filling in a way that modern breakfasts rarely achieve. The secret was in the stirring, constant, gentle circles that kept the cornmeal from clumping, creating a smooth, creamy texture that would coat your spoon and warm you from the inside out. Some families would add a pinch of sugar if they had it, or a dollop of butter to make it rich. Others kept it plain, letting the natural sweetness of the corn shine through. But here's the clever part. Let it set overnight in a greased pan, and the next morning you could slice it thick and fry it crisp in bacon fat, until golden and crunchy on the outside, still creamy within. This gave you two completely different meals from the same simple ingredients. Proof of the resourcefulness that kept farm families fed. Cornmeal mush filled bowls and stretched budgets through the Dust Bowl and beyond, when wheat was scarce and money was scarcer. Children would eat it with spoons carved from apple wood, the sound of scraping echoing in kitchens lit by kerosene lamps before the sun came up. Dandelion Omelet. What if breakfast came from weeds growing between fence posts and along the garden path? In the early days of spring, when winter stores were running low and fresh food was still weeks away, farm wives would venture out with baskets and sharp knives, gathering the tender young leaves of dandelions before they turned bitter with age. The skillet pops and sizzles with butter, real butter churned just days before, as bitter greens wilt down, releasing their earthy aroma while steam fogs up the kitchen window. You could smell the promise of spring in those leaves, mixed with the rich scent of eggs cracking into the pan. Dandelion leaves, 2 precious eggs, maybe a wild onion pulled from the edge of the woods, and a pinch of salt, all harvested by hand and stirred together with the kind of care that comes from knowing every ingredient has been earned through work and patience. The mixture would be whisked together with a fork until the bright yellow yolks streaked through the dark green leaves, then poured into the hot skillet where it would set up into something that smelled earthy, sharp and wild, like the countryside itself had been captured on a plate. Hens laid fewer eggs during the lean winter months and through wartime rationing, so families learned to stretch them with whatever they could forage. Dandelion greens provided vitamins that had been missing from their diet for months, along with a bitter bite that somehow made the eggs taste richer and more complex. "If it's green and not poison, it's breakfast," the old farmhouse saying went, and women passed down the knowledge of which wild plants were safe and which would put you in the ground. Dandelions were among the safest bets, abundant, nutritious, and free for the taking. Fried apples and bread. Could apples and old bread really pass for something sweet enough to start the day with a smile? Picture this: slices of apples sizzling in a heavy cast-iron pan with melted butter, the kitchen filling with the scent of cinnamon like a warm hug from autumn itself, even in the dead of winter when fresh fruit was a distant memory. Just apples, maybe from the cellar where they'd been stored in sawdust since harvest, their skins wrinkled but their flesh still sweet. Butter saved from the weekly churning, stale bread that would have gone to the chickens otherwise, a precious spoonful of white sugar if the family was doing well, and a pinch of cinnamon that had to last until the next trip to town. You'd start by slicing the apples thin, letting them soften and caramelize in the butter until they turned golden and started to smell like pie filling. Then came the bread, torn into rough chunks and tossed into the same pan, soaking up all those apple juices and butter until the pieces turned golden and crispy on the outside while staying tender within. The result felt like eating pie without the crust, comforting, sweet, and dirt cheap to make. Children would fight over the last crispy bits of bread that had absorbed the most apple flavor, while mothers smiled knowing they'd turned potential waste into something that felt like a treat. Coffee soup. What kind of soup do you serve before sunrise, when the only heat in the house comes from the kitchen stove and children need something warm in their bellies before walking 2 miles to the schoolhouse? Picture the scene. The kettle whistles on the stovetop while hot, strong coffee pours over torn-up pieces of day-old bread in chipped enamel bowls, creating something between breakfast and survival. Day-old bread, maybe cornbread from the night before, or biscuits that had gone hard overnight, broken into rough chunks and placed in bowls that had seen better days. Then came the coffee, black as midnight and strong enough to wake the dead, poured steaming hot over the bread until it softened into something resembling porridge. Add sugar if you had some, a luxury during the Depression years when every penny counted and sweeteners were saved for special occasions. Most families served it plain, letting the bitter bite of the coffee mingle with the yeasty flavor of the bread, creating something that was more about warmth and caffeine than actual taste. Steam would rise from each bowl as children gathered around the kitchen table, still half asleep but needing fuel for the day ahead. They'd slurp their morning meal with spoons that clinked against the enamel, the sound echoing in kitchens where conversation was often scarce before the sun came up and chores began in earnest. It was bitter, certainly, but it filled the stomach and provided the energy needed for a day of hard work. The bread would soak up the coffee until it became soft and warm, creating a texture that was surprisingly satisfying despite its humble origins. "We drank our breakfast and it kept us moving," Pop used to say, remembering mornings when there wasn't much else in the pantry besides coffee grounds and yesterday's bread. Cold biscuit milk. Ever pour cold milk over yesterday's biscuits like they were breakfast cereal? Picture the scene. Early morning light filtering through farmhouse windows while crumbs float in mason jars. The gentle sound of spoons clinking against glass, echoing in a kitchen where waste was not just frowned upon, it was practically a sin. Just stale biscuits, maybe left over from the night before when the family had eaten their fill of beans and cornbread, broken into rough pieces and dropped into whatever vessel was handy. Then came the cold milk, fresh from the morning milking, poured over the biscuit pieces until they began to soften and absorb the creamy richness. Sometimes, if the family had been blessed with a good harvest or a successful trip to town, There might be a drop of syrup stirred in, sorghum molasses that would swirl through the milk like ribbons of amber sweetness. But more often than not, it was served plain, the natural sweetness of the milk and the yeasty flavor of the biscuits, combining into something simple but satisfying. It would be eaten straight from the cup or jar, children tilting their heads back to catch the last sweet drops, while mothers watched from the stove, already planning the day's meals around whatever remained in the pantry. The biscuits would become soft and custard-like, almost pudding in texture, while still maintaining little pockets of more solid bread that provided something to chew on. Oatmeal. Without oats, how do you serve a bowl of hot, satisfying oatmeal when actual oats are rationed, expensive, or simply unavailable? Picture a farmhouse kitchen during wartime, where every grain was precious, and creativity meant the difference between a satisfied family and empty bellies before the day's work began. A heavy pot of pearl barley simmers slow and steady on the back of the wood stove, filling the air with the scent of toasted grain and comfort. The barley would bubble gently, releasing its starch and creating a creamy, porridge-like consistency that closely mimicked the oatmeal that families remembered from better times. Barley, water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes cornmeal or ground rye, if that's what was available in the grain bin, all cooked together until tender and creamy. The process took patience, with frequent stirring to prevent sticking and to encourage the grains to release their natural starches and create that familiar oatmeal texture. It would thicken with stirring, each spoonful creating little ribbons of steam in the cool morning air. The taste was nuttier than oats, earthier somehow, but when topped with milk and a precious spoonful of sugar or molasses, it provided the same warming, stick-to-your-ribs satisfaction that made oatmeal such a beloved breakfast staple. Wartime kitchens became laboratories of substitution and creativity, where cooks learned to fake familiar flavors using whatever grains they could get their hands on. Families would gather around the breakfast table, grateful for the warmth and sustenance, even if it wasn't quite what they remembered from peacetime mornings. "Closest we got to oatmeal some winters," they'd say with a philosophical shrug, spooning up the barley porridge while snow piled against the windows and the morning chores waited in the barn. It might not have been oats, but it was hot, filling, and made with love. Sometimes that had to be enough. Speaking of making do with what you had, did your grandma ever create her own bacon from ingredients that cost a fraction of the real thing? Fried bologna and eggs. What breakfast meat crackled and popped like bacon, but cost a tenth as much, and could feed a family of 6 without breaking the weekly grocery budget? Walk into any Depression-era farmhouse kitchen on a Saturday morning, and you'd likely smell the distinctive aroma of thick-cut bologna sizzling in a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet. The bologna would be sliced thick, about a 1/4 inch, and scored around the edges to prevent curling. As it hit the hot skillet, the fat would begin to render out, creating its own cooking medium, while the meat curled into little cup shapes that would later hold perfectly cooked eggs. The skillet would spit and crackle as the bologna cooked, the edges crisping up while the center stayed tender, creating a texture that was satisfying in a way that only fried meat can be. The smell was sharp and smoky, filling the kitchen with an aroma that would wake sleeping children and draw them to the breakfast table before their names were even called. Thick-cut bologna, fresh eggs from the hen house, a pinch of salt and pepper, and maybe a scrap of cheese if the family was doing particularly well, all cooked together in the same pan, the eggs frying in the rendered bologna fat and soaking up all those savory flavors that made even simple ingredients taste like a feast. The eggs would cook with perfectly runny yolks that would break and run into the crispy bologna, creating a rich, satisfying combination that felt like a diner plate, despite costing pennies to prepare. Children would use pieces of day-old bread to soak up every last bit of egg yolk and bologna fat, making sure nothing went to waste. Called it poor man's steak, and we loved every bite," Dad used to say proudly, remembering mornings when Bologna and eggs felt like luxury compared to the coffee soup and cold biscuit milk that had sustained the family through leaner times. But farmhouse creativity didn't stop with affordable meat substitutes. Sometimes even vegetables found their way into pancake batter. Potato flapjacks. Could leftover mashed potatoes really be transformed into something resembling pancakes? Picture this transformation. Yesterday's dinner potatoes, cold and lumpy from sitting overnight in a covered pot beside the stove, suddenly becoming the star of the morning meal through nothing more than farmhouse ingenuity and a hot griddle. The batter hits the griddle with a soft thud rather than the usual hiss of regular pancake batter, thicker, more substantial, carrying the weight of actual vegetables rather than just flour and water. Steam curls around the cast iron surface as the potato mixture slowly heats and begins to set, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of home-cooked potatoes getting a second chance at glory. Leftover mashed potatoes formed the base, usually made with milk and butter if the family was doing well, or just potatoes and water during leaner times. To this base, cooks would add flour to bind everything together, an egg if the hens were laying well, a pinch of salt to enhance the flavors, and a splash of milk to thin the mixture to the right consistency for spreading on the griddle. They would fry up golden brown, the edges crisping beautifully while the interior stayed fluffy and tender, tasting like a cross between a pancake and a potato cake. The natural starch in the potatoes helped create structure, while any butter or milk in the original mash added richness that made these flapjacks surprisingly satisfying. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and grew well in most climates, making them a staple that helped stretch flour supplies and create hearty breakfast stacks even when money was tight. A family could eat these potato pancakes and feel genuinely satisfied, not just fed, an important distinction during times when every meal needed to provide energy for hard physical work. "These stuck with you till noon," Mom would swear, flipping another batch on the griddle while children waited with plates and forks, knowing that these substantial pancakes would fuel them through morning chores and the walk to school. And if potato peels could become flapjacks, what about other parts of foods that usually went to waste? Apple peel, fritters. Ever considered frying just the apple peels? Those colorful ribbons that usually ended up in the compost heap or fed to the pigs? Picture a thrifty farmhouse cook standing at the kitchen counter, methodically peeling apples for pie or sauce, but instead of discarding those long, curly strips of peel, saving them for something special. The pan would sizzle with the scent of cinnamon and bubbling butter, filling the kitchen with an aroma that spoke of autumn orchards and careful household management. Those discarded apple peels would dance like ribbons in the hot fat, their edges crisping and curling as they transformed from waste into something surprisingly delicious. Apple peels, still carrying the sweet flesh and natural sugars that made them worth saving, would be tossed with a spoonful of precious white sugar, a pat of butter, and just enough flour to create a light batter that would help everything hold together in the hot skillet. Sometimes a pinch of cinnamon would be added if the spice tin wasn't completely empty from the last baking session. The cook would stir gently as the peels softened and caramelized, the sugar helping them turn golden and crispy, while the natural fruit flavors concentrated and intensified. The result was something like apple chips crossed with fritters, sweet, crunchy, and absolutely nothing like the waste product they had started as. It was a perfect example of turning scraps into warmth, transforming what most people threw away into something that could brighten a breakfast table and make children smile. These fritters proved that with enough creativity and respect for ingredients, even garbage could become gold. "Not one bit wasted," Grandma would smile, spooning the golden peels onto plates while the morning light streamed through windows that looked out over the apple orchard where these very peels had started their journey from tree to table. And just when you thought farmhouse creativity had reached its limits, cooks found ways to give life back to other leftover ingredients. Fried grit cakes. What if yesterday's creamy grits came back crunchier and more interesting the next morning? Picture the transformation that happened overnight in farmhouse kitchens. Hot, smooth grits that had comforted the family at dinner would cool and firm up in their pot, becoming something entirely different by the time the sun came up and breakfast needed to be prepared. The kitchen would smell of bacon fat and anticipation as thick slices of cold grits were carefully cut from the solidified mass and placed in a cast-iron pan where they would undergo their breakfast resurrection. The outside would begin to crisp and brown while the interior stayed soft and creamy, creating a textural contrast that made yesterday's dinner feel like an entirely new dish. Cold grits, a generous pinch of salt, a spoonful of bacon grease saved from previous mornings, and maybe a light dusting of flour to help them hold together, sliced thick like bread, and fried on both sides until golden brown and crispy on the outside, while remaining tender and smooth within. The grits would develop a beautiful crust, almost like a corn cake, while maintaining that familiar creamy interior texture that made grits such a beloved Southern staple. This double-duty approach to cooking meant that families got two completely different meals from the same basic ingredients, stretching both food supplies and food budgets while providing variety that kept even simple meals interesting. Mama used to say, "Make it once, feed 'em twice." Next up came a dish that demonstrated just how far farmhouse creativity could stretch when even basic ingredients like eggs became too expensive or unavailable. Hoover Eggs. Could flour and water really pass for eggs when real ones became too precious to crack? Named after President Hoover during the depths of the Depression, this ingenious substitute showed just how far American ingenuity could stretch when times got desperate and creativity became a matter of survival rather than choice. Picture a hot skillet where a simple paste of flour and water bubbles and sets like scrambled eggs might transforming simple pantry staples into something that could at least provide the visual and textural experience of eggs, even if the taste was purely imagination and hope. Just white flour, water, a touch of salt to enhance what little flavor there was, stirred together until smooth and creamy, then spread thin on a hot griddle where it would set and cook like the most optimistic of breakfasts. The cook would scrape and stir it as it cooked, creating fluffy, light pieces that resembled scrambled eggs in texture, if not in taste. The result was fluffy, warm, and filling, a ghost of the real thing that could at least provide substance and the psychological comfort of eating something that looked familiar. When topped with a bit of butter or served alongside other breakfast items, it could almost convince hungry children that they were eating something special rather than just cooked flour. But farmhouse tables weren't always about substitutes and making do. Sometimes nature provided its own sweeteners that could make even simple bread feel like a treat. Sorghum, molasses, and cornbread. What if your morning sweetness came not from a store-bought jar, but from the sorghum patch growing just beyond the vegetable garden? Picture the scene. A warm wedge of golden cornbread sitting steaming on a rough wooden table, while thick sorghum molasses glistens on top like liquid amber, catching the early morning light streaming through farmhouse windows. The cornbread itself was simplicity. Cornmeal ground from their own corn, lard rendered from their own hogs, baking powder if they could afford it, salt from the general store, and water from their own well, mixed together and baked in a cast-iron skillet until the edges turned golden and the center set up firm but tender. But the real star was the sorghum molasses, made right there on the farm from sorghum cane that grew tall and sweet in fields where corn might struggle. The sweet smell would fill the morning air, earthy and warm, with a complexity that store-bought sugar couldn't touch. This was the South's answer to sweetening before commercial sugar became widely available and affordable. Families would gather around their breakfast table, spreading the thick molasses on cornbread that was still warm from the oven, creating a combination that was both simple and satisfying. stickier than honey and twice as hearty. But not all cornbread was served soft and sweet. Sometimes it was made to provide texture and substance in completely different ways. Milk toast. Can toast really comfort a child with an empty stomach and a heart that needs warming? Picture this gentle scene. A chipped ceramic bowl holding pieces of carefully browned bread floating in warm milk, steam curling upward in a kitchen where comfort was measured not in luxury, but in simple, nurturing gestures. The bread would be toasted to a perfect golden brown, not too dark, which would make it bitter, but deep enough to provide structural integrity when it met the warm milk. Toasted bread, hot milk, that dab of butter for richness, and perhaps a sprinkle of sweetness, assembled in bowls that had seen countless meals and provided comfort to multiple generations of the same family. The bread would soften gradually, absorbing the warm milk until it reached a consistency somewhere between pudding and porridge. The texture was part of the appeal, soft enough for a sick child to manage, warm enough to provide internal comfort, and familiar enough to feel like a hug served in a bowl. It was food as comfort, prepared with the kind of attention that showed love even when resources were limited. Speaking of different approaches to familiar ingredients, sometimes cornbread got a protein boost that made it substantial enough to serve as a complete meal. Cracklin Cornbread. What makes cornbread crackle audibly as you chew, providing both texture and the kind of protein that could sustain a working family through a morning of heavy labor? Picture the scene, an oven crackling with heat, while a seasoned cast-iron skillet bubbles with pork fat and golden cornmeal batter, creating something that was part bread, part meat dish, and completely satisfying. The secret ingredient was cracklings, those crispy bits of pork skin and fat left over from rendering lard, chopped fine and mixed directly into the cornbread batter before baking. These little nuggets of concentrated pork flavor would crisp up even further in the oven heat, creating pockets of intense savoriness throughout the bread. The batter would sizzle as it hit the hot, greased skillet, the edges beginning to set immediately, while the center stayed soft and ready to bake through. It would emerge from the oven golden brown, the edges deeply crispy, while the interior stayed tender and slightly crumbly. The bits of crackling provided bursts of rich, porky flavor and a satisfying crunch that made each bite interesting and filling. Now here's where breakfast got really interesting, when families reached back to grains and cooking methods that predated modern agriculture. Wheat berry porridge. How chewy and satisfying is your breakfast when it starts with whole grain kernels that haven't been processed, refined, or stripped of their natural nutrition? Picture a heavy pot simmering slowly on the back of the wood stove, wheat berries popping softly as they gradually cook down from hard, individual kernels into something tender enough to eat, but substantial enough to provide lasting energy. Wheat berries, the whole unprocessed grain kernels, required patience and planning. They needed to be soaked overnight to soften, then simmered for hours until they reached the perfect texture, tender enough to chew comfortably, but still retaining enough structure to provide interesting texture and lasting satisfaction. The cooking process filled the kitchen with a nutty, toasted aroma that spoke of grain fields and honest work. Wheat berry porridge was the backbone of many farm families' morning meals, especially during times when other breakfast options were limited or when the budget required stretching every ingredient as far as possible. One pot could feed a large family, and the leftover porridge could be fried up the next morning, just like those grit cakes. And then came one of the most unusual breakfast accompaniments ever created in American farmhouse kitchens: peanut butter gravy on biscuits. Ever pour peanut butter into a hot skillet and transform it into something resembling the sausage gravy that usually graced Sunday morning biscuits? Picture this scene. The scent of roasted peanuts and hot, fluffy biscuits filling a farmhouse kitchen while a cook stirs something unexpected and surprisingly delicious in a cast-iron pan. The process started with peanut butter. maybe the kind ground fresh at the general store, or homemade from peanuts grown in the back 40 and processed through a hand crank grinder. This was mixed with flour to create a roux, then thinned with water or milk, and seasoned with salt until it reached the consistency of traditional sausage gravy. Just peanut butter, flour, liquid, and salt, stirred constantly in a hot skillet until it bubbled and thickened into something that could be ladled over split biscuits, like the most unusual gravy ever invented. The cooking process mellowed the peanut flavor slightly, while creating a rich, nutty sauce that clung to bread and provided protein that sausage gravy couldn't match. Served over fresh-baked biscuits that were still steaming from the oven, it created a combination that was both familiar and completely unexpected. The saltiness played against the natural sweetness of the peanuts, while the gravy consistency made it feel like a proper breakfast accompaniment, despite its unconventional ingredients. This was the answer when meat was too expensive or unavailable, when families needed protein but couldn't afford the traditional sources. Peanut butter provided fat, protein, and calories in a shelf-stable form that could be transformed into multiple different dishes depending on the family's needs. Had us licking our plates clean, Dad would remember, thinking back to mornings when peanut butter gravy felt like an indulgence rather than a substitute, when creativity in the kitchen made even unusual combinations taste like exactly what the family needed. And speaking of substantial breakfast foods that could stick with you through a morning of hard work, lard-fried dough sinkers. What breakfast feels heavy as a stone, but provides the kind of sustained energy that could fuel a morning of chopping wood or milking cows. Picture chunks of simple dough sizzling in a pot of hot lard, the fat popping and crackling as dense, satisfying pieces of fried dough emerged golden and crispy on the outside, while staying tender and substantial within. The lard would be heated in a heavy pot until it reached the perfect temperature for frying, hot enough to create immediate sizzling when the dough hit the surface, but not so hot that the outside burned before the inside cooked through. The sound was distinctive, a sharp hiss, followed by steady bubbling as the dough pieces bobbed in the hot fat. Flour, water, salt, and baking powder formed the basic dough, mixed just enough to come together, but not so much that it became tough. The dough would be torn into rough, irregular chunks rather than shaped into perfect pieces, giving each sinker a rustic, homemade appearance that spoke of kitchens where efficiency mattered more than presentation. These chunks would be dropped into the bubbling lard where they'd puff slightly but remain dense and substantial. The outside would crisp to a beautiful golden brown while the interior stayed soft and doughy, creating a textural contrast that was deeply satisfying. Sinkers got their name because they were so filling. 2 or 3 pieces would sink into your stomach and keep you satisfied for hours. They were cheap to make, used basic pantry staples, and provided the kind of stick-to-your-ribs nourishment that working families needed to sustain themselves through physically demanding days. 2 of those and you were set till supper, Grandma would laugh, watching family members eye the remaining sinkers in the basket, knowing that these simple fried dough pieces could carry them through whatever the day might bring. But farmhouse resourcefulness extended beyond just food preparation. It included creating substitutes for ingredients that became unavailable during wartime rationing. Sorghum coffee substitutes. Could you really roast grains and seeds until they produced something that resembled coffee enough to fool sleepy morning minds? Picture a cast-iron pan heating slowly on the wood stove while sorghum seeds, those same grains that produced molasses, toasted and popped like tiny firecrackers, filling the kitchen with nutty, roasted aromas that almost convinced you the real thing was brewing. When wartime rationing made coffee scarce or too expensive for daily consumption, farm families turned to their own fields for alternatives. Sorghum seeds were perfect for this purpose. Abundant, easy to grow, and capable of producing deep, complex flavors when roasted properly. The process required patience and attention. Sorghum seeds would be spread in a thin layer in a hot, dry skillet and stirred constantly to prevent burning while they gradually darkened and developed the kind of deep, toasted flavors that coffee drinkers craved. Once properly roasted, the seeds would be ground in a hand-crank coffee mill, the same equipment used for real coffee, until they reached the right consistency for brewing. The grounds would then be steeped in hot water, using the same methods families had always used for their morning coffee ritual. The result smelled nutty and warm, tasted deep and toasty, with hints of the grain's natural sweetness, and provided the psychological comfort of a hot morning beverage, even if it couldn't deliver the caffeine kick that real coffee provided. Rice and raisin porridge. How far could a scoop of cold, leftover rice really stretch when transformed with a little creativity and some simple additions? Picture last night's rice, maybe served alongside beans or vegetables at supper, getting a second life in a small pot where it would bubble gently with milk and sweetening, becoming something entirely different from its dinner incarnation. The process was simple but transformative. Cold rice from the previous evening's meal would be combined with water or milk in a heavy-bottomed pot, then simmered slowly until the grains softened and released their starch, creating a creamy, porridge-like consistency that was both familiar and new. Rice, liquid, a pinch of salt to enhance the flavors, and whatever sweetening was available, maybe a handful of raisins that had been stored since the last grape harvest, or a spoonful of molasses if the sorghum processing had been successful. The raisins would plump as they cooked, adding bursts of concentrated sweetness throughout the creamy rice. Simmered slowly until thick and warm, the raisins soft and sweet, the dish became something that felt like dessert for breakfast. Rice pudding's simpler cousin that required no special ingredients or advanced planning, just yesterday's dinner and a little morning creativity. It gave a second, completely different life to leftovers while stretching the family food budget and ensuring that nothing edible ever went to waste. One pot of rice could become 2 different meals, doubling its value and providing variety that kept even simple diets interesting. Fried oat cakes. What if your morning oatmeal could return the next day with a completely different texture and an even more satisfying taste? Picture a chilly farmhouse kitchen where leftover oats from the previous morning are transformed through the magic of hot fat, and a cast-iron skillet into something crispy, golden, and surprisingly elegant. The process began with oatmeal that had been cooked the day before, thick, creamy porridge that had cooled and firmed up overnight in a covered pot beside the stove. This cold, solid mass would be mixed with just enough flour to help it hold together, a bit of lard or bacon grease for richness, and a pinch of salt to enhance all the flavors. The mixture would be shaped into rough patties, not perfectly round like modern pancakes, but rustic, hand-formed cakes that spoke of kitchens where function mattered more than appearance. These would be placed carefully in a hot skillet, where they'd fry up golden brown, the outside developing a beautiful crust, while the interior stayed tender and warm. The smell was nutty and familiar, like toast crossed with the best oatmeal you'd ever eaten. The texture was revelatory, crispy edges giving way to a soft, creamy center that still carried all the comfort of the original oatmeal, but with an added dimension that made it feel like an entirely new dish. These oat cakes proved that leftovers didn't have to feel like settling for second best. With a little creativity and the application of heat and fat, yesterday's breakfast could become today's specialty, showing once again how farmhouse cooks could make magic from the most ordinary ingredients. My daddy used to say, "Ain't no shame in eating the same thing twice if it's hot and tastes different." Aunt Louise would laugh, remembering mornings when fried oat cakes felt like a special treat rather than repurposed leftovers. Just like those grit cakes we talked about earlier, this proved that farmhouse cooks understood the alchemy of transforming simple starches into something special. Corn dodger patties. What if cornbread could be transformed into something resembling a breakfast burger? substantial enough to fill hungry stomachs and portable enough to wrap in a cloth and take to the fields. Picture thick corn patties hitting hot bacon fat in a cast-iron skillet, the air immediately filling with the distinctive smell of corn and rendered pork that defined so many southern farmhouse kitchens. The skillet would hiss and pop as the patties made contact with the hot fat, their surfaces beginning to crisp and brown, while the interiors stayed fluffy and tender. These weren't delicate pancakes, they were substantial, hearty cakes that could anchor a working man's breakfast and provide energy that would last through hours of physical labor. Cornmeal mixed with hot water, a generous spoonful of lard for richness, and salt for flavor, formed into thick, palm-sized patties that were more like small corn cakes than anything resembling modern pancakes. Beet sugar syrup and pancakes. Can you make syrup sweet enough to rival store-bought varieties using nothing but beets from your own garden? Picture the early morning light filtering through a farmhouse kitchen where a pot of homemade beet syrup simmers patiently on the back burner, its deep red color catching the glow while filling the air with an earthy sweetness that spoke of soil and sunshine. The process began with sugar beets, not the red beets most people think of today, but pale, sweet varieties specifically grown for sugar production. These would be sliced thin, covered with water, and boiled for hours until the liquid reduced to a thick, amber syrup that rivaled anything available at the general store. Beets, water, patience, and time boiled down slowly until the natural sugars concentrated into something rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. The flavor was different from cane sugar syrup, earthier somehow, with undertones that spoke of the garden soil where the beets had grown. Poured over flapjacks, maybe even those eggless depression pancakes we started with, the syrup would soak into the bread, creating layers of flavor that transformed simple pancakes into something that felt indulgent and special. When sugar imports slowed during wartime or when money was too tight for store-bought sweeteners, families turned to their own gardens for solutions. Beet syrup represented hours of work, but it also meant months of breakfast pleasure without spending precious cash on commercial products. Didn't need much, just a drizzle woke up the whole stack. Grandma June would smile, remembering mornings when homemade beet syrup made even the simplest pancakes taste like a celebration. Coming up next was a dish so traditional and potentially dangerous that it came with warnings passed down through generations. Lye Hominy with bacon drippings. Would you risk chemical burns to transform hard field corn into something edible, nutritious, and filling enough to sustain a family through lean times? Picture a heavy pot bubbling ominously as corn kernels, soaked in dangerous lye water, slowly softened and swelled into the chewy, pearl-like hominy that would become a breakfast staple throughout the rural South. The process was not for the careless or inexperienced. Dried corn would be soaked in water mixed with lye, the same caustic substance used for making soap, until the hulls loosened and the kernels swelled into something resembling large, chewy pearls. But lye was dangerous. Too much could poison a family. Too little wouldn't process the corn properly, and failure to rinse the finished hominy thoroughly could result in chemical burns to the mouth and throat. This was knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters, with warnings and techniques refined through generations of careful practice. The smell during processing was sharp and chemical, mixing with the scent of corn and the ever-present aroma of bacon grease that would be used for the final cooking. Once properly rinsed, and this step was critical, the hominy would be pan-fried in saved bacon fat until slightly crispy on the outside while remaining tender and chewy within. The lye process was risky, but it transformed hard, indelible field corn into something that could feed a family when other food sources were scarce. It was also a way to preserve corn for long periods, extending the harvest through winter months when fresh food was unavailable. Hominy represented survival skills passed down from Native American traditions and refined by Appalachian families who understood that sometimes dangerous processes were necessary for survival. "Don't mess up the rinse, or you'll know it quick," Uncle Del would warn with a grin, remembering the careful attention required to transform potentially deadly ingredients into life-sustaining food. Think of this as the cousin to that sorghum coffee we discussed, both born of necessity and requiring specialized knowledge to execute safely. Vinegar pie for breakfast. Ever consider eating pie for breakfast, especially pie made from vinegar instead of expensive fruit? Picture a golden brown pie emerging from the wood-fired oven, filling the kitchen with an aroma that was simultaneously tart and sweet, creating something that seemed impossible but tasted surprisingly like the lemon pie that most families couldn't afford to make. The kitchen would smell like a perfect balance of opposing forces. The sharpness of vinegar mellowed by sugar and eggs, creating something that was bright and tangy without being harsh. This was Depression-era ingenuity at its finest, using pantry staples to create the illusion of luxury. Flour, sugar, butter, precious eggs, and a carefully measured spoonful of vinegar for that essential tang, mixed into a custard filling that would set up smooth and bright, almost lemony in its tartness. The vinegar provided the acid that expensive lemons would have contributed, while sugar balanced the sharpness into something genuinely pleasant. The filling would be smooth and creamy, with a brightness that woke up the palate and made even simple breakfast seem special. The crust, made from lard and flour, provided richness and substance that transformed what could have been a simple custard into something worthy of being called pie. This Depression-era creation sometimes graced breakfast tables when nothing else was available to start the day with something sweet. It proved that even the most unlikely ingredients could be transformed into something that felt like a treat rather than a hardship. "Mama said if it tasted good, we didn't ask too many questions about how she made it," Aunt Trudy would laugh, remembering mornings when vinegar pie felt like getting away with something rather than making do with what was available. Just like those apple peel fritters we discussed earlier, this dish proved that scraps and substitutes could sing when handled with skill and creativity. Government cheese omelet. What could you create with a block of bright orange cheese that arrived courtesy of USDA surplus programs? Picture the distinctive smell of government cheese melting into beaten eggs in a well-seasoned cast-iron pan, creating something that was both humble and surprisingly satisfying, a reminder of how families made the best of assistance programs during tough economic times. The cheese was unmistakable. Bright orange, dense, and with a flavor that was both sharp and salty, distinctly different from anything you could buy in stores. It came in large blocks, wrapped in simple packaging that announced its governmental origins, but it melted beautifully and added rich, creamy texture to simple egg dishes. Eggs from the hen house, if the family was fortunate enough to have chickens, or eggs purchased carefully from the grocery budget, combined with generous chunks of the orange cheese and maybe a spoonful of milk to make the mixture extra creamy. Sometimes wild herbs from the yard would be added for color and flavor. The cheese would melt thick and gooey, creating the kind of creamy, indulgent texture that made even simple eggs feel like a special occasion meal. It was salty and sharp, with a richness that could stretch a couple of eggs into a meal that would satisfy several people. In the 1980s, many farm families relied on USDA surplus programs to supplement their food supplies, especially during economic downturns that made even basic groceries difficult to afford. The cheese became a staple ingredient that appeared in countless meals, transformed by creative cooks into dishes that felt generous rather than charitable. "Best omelet we ever ate was made with free cheese," Cousin Larry would declare, licking his fork clean and remembering mornings when government assistance felt like abundance rather than charity. From those Hoover eggs we discussed earlier to this government cheese creation, the evolution of survival cooking showed how American families adapted to whatever ingredients were available. Corn cob jelly on toast. Could you really make jelly from corn cobs, those leftover cores that most people threw to the animals or used for kindling? Picture a pot of pale pink liquid simmering on the back of the stove, extracted from discarded corn cobs and now transformed into something surprisingly delicious that would grace breakfast tables with the kind of creativity that defined rural American cooking. The process began after corn had been cut from the cob for other meals: creamed corn, cornbread, or succotash. Instead of discarding those stripped cobs, resourceful cooks would cover them with water and boil them for hours, extracting the natural sugars and pectin that remained in the woody cores. Corn cobs, sugar when it could be spared, maybe a strip of lemon peel if lemons were available, and water, boiled together until the liquid took on a pale pink color and developed the floral sweetness that made this jelly so surprisingly appealing. The natural pectin in the corn cobs helped the mixture set up properly, while the extracted corn sugars provided a delicate, almost floral sweetness that was nothing like what you'd expect from something so humble. The finished jelly was clear, light-colored, and had a taste that was subtle and sophisticated. Fried green tomato sandwiches. What do you do when early frost threatens and the tomato vines are still heavy with fruit that won't have time to ripen? Picture thick slices of green tomatoes sizzling in a hot cast-iron skillet, their surfaces golden with cornmeal coating, while the kitchen fills with the aroma of something that would become a beloved Southern breakfast tradition. The skillet would hiss and pop as the tomato slices, dredged in seasoned cornmeal, hit the hot bacon grease or lard. The coating would crisp up beautifully, while the green tomatoes inside stayed firm but tender, creating a textural contrast that was both satisfying and unique. Green tomatoes, picked before frost could ruin them, sliced thick enough to hold together during frying, dredged in cornmeal mixed with salt and pepper, then fried in whatever fat was available until golden brown and crispy on both sides. The result was tangy, hot, and crunchy, with a flavor that was distinctly tomato-like but sharper and more acidic than ripe tomatoes. Stacked on thick slices of homemade bread with maybe a smear of mustard or mayonnaise if the family was doing well, they made a breakfast or lunch that used crops that would otherwise have gone to waste. This was Southern ingenuity born of necessity, understanding that even unripe vegetables could be transformed into something delicious with the right preparation. It represented the kind of resourcefulness that kept farm families fed while ensuring that nothing from the garden ever went to waste. "Don't knock it till you've had 3, Uncle Walt would challenge visitors, watching as skeptical faces transformed into surprised delight after tasting these unlikely breakfast sandwiches. Remember those dandelion omelets we discussed earlier? This dish showed the same wild spirit of finding food in unexpected places, just using cultivated plants instead of foraged ones. Molasses Milkshake. How do you create the illusion of an ice cream parlor treat using nothing more than what every farm family had on hand? Picture a tall glass where cold, fresh milk and thick molasses are stirred vigorously until they become frothy and light, creating something that felt indulgent and special, despite being made from the most basic ingredients. In the days before electric blenders, this mixing had to be done by hand, stirring vigorously with a long spoon until the molasses fully incorporated into the milk and the mixture became light and airy. The process took patience and energy, but the result was worth the effort. Cold milk, fresh from the morning milking and kept cool in the springhouse or root cellar, combined with a generous spoonful of molasses, maybe sorghum molasses made right on the farm, or blackstrap molasses purchased from the general store if money allowed for such luxuries. Sometimes a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg would be added, spices that enhanced the complexity of the molasses while adding warmth and depth to the overall flavor. The finished drink would be creamy, rich, and loaded with iron and minerals that growing children needed. The molasses provided intense sweetness with a depth and complexity that refined sugar couldn't match, while the cold milk balanced the intensity and created a smooth, satisfying texture. It was both refreshing and nourishing, providing calories and nutrients that could sustain a person through morning chores. Better than anything from a soda fountain, and cheaper, too, Grandma would beam, watching children drain their glasses and ask for seconds, knowing that this simple treat provided both pleasure and nutrition without straining the family budget. Coming up next is our grand finale, a dish that demonstrated the ultimate expression of farmhouse frugality by using every possible part of the family hog: Scrapple Breakfast Fry. What if your morning meal could incorporate every edible part of the pig, transforming scraps and trimmings into something so satisfying that it became a regional delicacy? Picture thick slices of scrapple sizzling in a cast-iron pan, each piece crisping up golden at the edges while staying soft and rich in the middle, filling the kitchen with an aroma that was unmistakably porky and completely irresistible. The pan would crackle and spit as the scrapple cooked, its surface browning beautifully while the interior remained tender and full of complex flavors that spoke of hours of careful preparation and generations of accumulated wisdom about using every bit of the family hog. Scrapple represented the ultimate in farmhouse economy. Pork scraps that might include pieces of the head, heart, liver, and other organs, combined with cornmeal and flour, seasoned with sage and other herbs, then boiled together until it formed a thick, cohesive mass that could be molded into loaf pans and allowed to set. The cooking process took most of a day, with careful stirring and seasoning adjustments until the mixture reached the perfect consistency. Once cooled and firm, it could be sliced thick and fried until crispy on the outside while remaining creamy and flavorful within. The taste was rich, complex, and undeniably satisfying, like the best sausage crossed with the most flavorful cornbread, seasoned with herbs and spices that enhanced rather than masked the essential pork flavors. It was filling, nutritious, and used parts of the animal that might otherwise have been wasted. Scrapple could be served alongside eggs, topped with apples from the orchard, or eaten on its own as a substantial breakfast that would sustain a person through hours of physical labor. It represented the kind of nose-to-tail cooking that modern chefs celebrate, but that farm families practiced out of necessity. From the snout to the tail, we ate it all, Uncle John would declare proudly, remembering butchering days when every part of the hog was carefully preserved and transformed into meals that would last through winter months. Like those potato flapjacks and Hoover Eggs we discussed earlier, Scrapple proved that farmhouse cooks could make absolutely nothing go to waste while creating dishes that were genuinely delicious rather than just economical. Thank you for joining us at this virtual farmhouse table where we've shared the morning meals that sustained America through its most challenging times. We hope these 30 breakfast recipes have stirred more than just memories. Perhaps they've awakened an appreciation for the ingenuity, resourcefulness, and unshakable optimism that characterized rural American families. These weren't just meals, they were lessons in making the most of what you have, in finding abundance within scarcity, and in understanding that the most satisfying foods often come from the simplest ingredients prepared with care, creativity, and love. Each dish tells a story of adaptation, of families who refused to let hard times diminish their spirit or their tables. From eggless pancakes that proved you don't need everything to make something wonderful, to corn cob jelly that transformed waste into treasure, These recipes represent a kind of kitchen wisdom that modern cooks can still learn from. In our current age of abundance and convenience, there's something both humbling and inspiring about these farmhouse breakfasts. They remind us that satisfaction doesn't always come from having the most expensive ingredients or the latest equipment. Sometimes it comes from understanding how to coax flavor and nourishment from whatever happens to be on hand. These meals fed the people who built America's infrastructure, who survived the Great Depression, who worked the land and raised the families that would go on to create the prosperity we enjoy today. They represent not just survival, but the kind of resilience and creativity that turned survival into something approaching abundance. Perhaps most importantly, these breakfasts were shared around tables where families gathered not just to eat, but to connect, to plan their days, to share their hopes and concerns, and to strengthen the bonds that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Tell us in the comments, which of these 30 farmhouse breakfasts brought back the strongest memories? Did your grandmother make any of these dishes? They're part of the American story, and they deserve to be passed down to future generations who might one day find themselves needing to remember how much can be accomplished with very little. After all, in learning about where we came from, we often discover lessons that can serve us well no matter where we're going.